Welcome back to the second video in the Tutorial Tuesday special about drum processing. This week it's all about making your snares not only fat, but also original by layering Foley sounds on top of it. So to start, I've again made a little selection with samples I like. I will use these for different layers in the final snare sound. Let's get started. The first snare sample I have here is just a plain 909 snare drum. It's even recorded in mono. I really like that high frequencies from the 909 snare drum, but the low end can be useful as well since it's got a nice peak around 200 Hz. Now the second snare is more bright and short and has a sharp attack. This will only accentuate the main attack of the snare. The third sample will provide the low end of the snare and is pretty punchy already. Now for those of you saying I can't find samples as punchy as those, look at the Loopmasters or Vengeance sample packs. These have great drum samples for this processed sound. The fourth layer is an acoustic snare drum. I will use this to add a bit of more live character into the electronic snare drum. I find that subtle use of live drums can really help bringing the sound to life. Let's start working on the first layer containing the mono 909 snare drum. You can also use a stereo sample, but I had this one already, so I decided to stick with it. I put on an EQ8 and set it to the high pass filter. Now I take out all of the low end. This removes all of the body and mud, but we're gonna use the body from another sample anyway. That brings us to the third layer, which contains the electronic snare drum sample with a very big low end. Again, I add an EQ8 to this track, but now I take out some of the high end, since I think that the 909 will fill that area out pretty nicely. So together the two snare samples sound like this. Still like crap, right? Time to balance the volume between those two samples a bit. I'm going to lower the 909 sample in volume, since I think it makes it sound a bit too bright. Another reason why it still sounds muddy is because the samples are way too long for my taste. Time to shorten their lengths, and then I like to fade them out by bringing up the fades automation. I'm aiming for that short and snappy, but still natural tail in the snare drum. Try to blend each layer's tail by making them a little bit different. See, that's much better. So let's blend in layer 2. This one is going to add some volume to the attack of the snare, so I can make it really short. Again, I'm using the fades to create that natural tail to the sample. Otherwise it sounds way too chopped and you might get clicks and pops in your sound which you don't want. Okay, so I think there is some mud in the third layer around 800 Hz. So let's add a small cut around that frequency area to see if we can clean it up a little bit. I also like to add a little boost around the frequency where the snare peaks, which with this one is 200 Hz. This will bring out the attack even more and give the snare some more body. The last thing to do with this EQ is roll off everything below 100 Hz, since we don't need that anyway. Don't forget you can shape each individual layer with the EQs. For instance, I'm lowering a specific frequency area in the high mids on the 909 snare. This creates a different feeling in the drum, making it more airy. If I do the same with the low layer of the snare, I can add more warmth, or make the initial snare drum sound brighter as well. Time to blend in the fourth layer, which contains the acoustic snare sample. First I make this sample a bit shorter, since the tail is quite long. Then I add a nice fade out again. Note that I'm cutting off quite a bit from the tail, since I want that short and snappy sound. This all comes back to what I said in last week's video. If you want to make your snare snappy, then that snappiness has to be in the sample already to get the best quality out of it. I then add an EQ8 and high pass this acoustic snare just above its peak frequency. This way I lose the body of this sample, but it will now blend nicely with the other samples. I still think there is some mud in the third layer, So I go into the EQ8 again and scoop out some more frequencies around 800 Hz, which clearly makes the snare sound better. So let's control the tail of the 909 snare a bit more precisely by adding some automation to the volume of this track. You can select an area and then drag the dashed line upwards or downwards to make the automation. Then click one of the dots to delete them and thus create a ramped line. Now with Live 9 you can create curved automation lines by holding down the Alt key and dragging the line up or down. So now I'm going to create a new audio track and send all the other layers to this track. Now if I solo the new audio track and set it to the input mode by clicking this in button, I can hear all the other tracks together and start processing them. So let's throw on an EQ8 and add a high pass filter to take out some of the sub frequencies, since these will be interfering with your sub bass in the final mix. Then I boost another time around the 200 Hz peak, which will make the peak even louder. You can then sculpt the mid-range to taste. I like using a wide cut to make some room for other mid-range instruments. So now my old friend Dominion comes to play again. If you don't know this plugin, please watch my kick drum processing special first. So let's add some attack to the snare to make it more punchy. And then I use the length slider to shape the length of this attack. Now I think blending in some high frequencies can bring out the attack even more. Now I slightly changed the sustain section, just to make sure we maintain our snappy sound. You can now change the sound of the snare by changing the EQ before Dominion. Do this if your snare sounds too bright or too muddy. Time to start working on making the snare a bit more special and original by adding Foley sounds to it. Foley sounds? Yes, sounds from everyday tools and objects used a lot in movie sound design, so why not use them in drum layering? With this you can significantly change the character of your drum sounds. First I sent this FX group to the same audio track, so the Foley sounds run through the Dominion plugin together with the snare samples. This will help to make them sound as one whole sound instead of multiple layers placed on top of your snare drum. So I already prepared these so I can briefly run you through. The first layer is the sound of breaking wood. I made the sample a bit shorter and applied some EQing to get rid of the low frequencies. So this is the snare with the breaking wood layer. And this is without. And again, with. Now maybe you don't hear any change, but I surely do. The attack sounds brighter, but only a little bit. The difference is very subtle, but these small things can really make or break a drum sound. Also listening on good studio monitors or decent headphone works to hear the differences. Now add a reverb to a send track. I already have the Ableton stock reverb loaded, and send the breaking wood sample to the reverb to add some flavor. For anybody of you thinking, where do I find these Foley samples? I've added a great website in the description below. Okay, so the second Foley layer is some kind of a metal slamming sound, which I made shorter and EQ'd it again to get rid of the low frequencies. I also sent this to the reverb. Together the two Foley layers sound pretty nice already, and they both sound good together with the main snare. So now I'll take you through the last three layers, very briefly showing you how these layers stacked up form a big layer to the snare drum. So the third Foley sound is from some falling metal or something. Made the sample short and EQ'd it again. So now the last two Foley layers are two samples, which I gave a fade in as well. So they only add to the till section of the snare and not to the attack. You could use plain white noise for this, but hey, we're trying to be more original, right? So some noisy Foley sounds also work for this kind of job. So altogether the Foley sounds actually start sounding like a snare itself, and I think with a little bit of processing you could actually make it become a good snare. But now, together with the main snare, it sounds like this. We just added a tiny bit of extra character to the snare and made the attack seem a bit brighter as well. Sweet! So now I'm going to throw on the ferric TDS to drive as much volume out of the snare without losing the punch. First I turn the limiter knob all the way up, and then I drive the input volume up into this limiter, keeping an ear on the attack of the snare since I don't want to lose this attack all the way. That was it for this week's Tutorial Tuesday special. Next week I'll show you some more on treating these drum sounds. See ya!